Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a good week. I had a trying week. My dog, Piper, well, let's just say she's about one wave short of a shipwreck. She decided this week to chase after a skunk one night. I was awoken by my husband, who also reeked of skunk, at 2:30 in the morning to tell me that Piper had been sprayed. I spent the rest of the early morning hours and most of the next day bathing her, scrubbing her, and then scrubbing my house over and over and over again to try and get the god-awful, burnt warthog-ass smell of skunk out of my house. After about 7 baths of lemon, baking soda, and vinegar, Piper began to smell a little bit better. And after about 3 days, it finally dissipated out of the house. But every once in a while, I get a phantom whiff of it. Ugh. It is nasty ass. It's a good thing she's cute. That's really all that's been happening around here. I've been busy writing and working on some side projects that I have on the go. I've got my first batch of feedback from one of my projects, and I'm quite happy with what I produced, and I will be editing and rewriting it and submitting it again. So we will see what happens. I will keep you informed. Oh, and I'll tell you what it is eventually. If you like the show, please head over to the Patreon page and support us. It keeps the lights on and allows me to keep bringing you these episodes. You can also support the show on Spotify, and if you're listening on Apple, please give the show a 5-star review. It really does help the show. And if you'd like to send me a suggestion for a future episode, or just want to send me an email that says, hey, I'm listening, you can email me at thebitterwitness@gmail.com. Well, the dogs are sleeping behind me, so Puppy ASMR will be brought to you by both Miley and Piper this week. So grab a cup of tea, sit back, and relax while I tell you about the Butcher of Elmendorf. As always, I want to give the victims in the case top billing. Hazel, Minnie, Julia, and all the unknown victims that we have in this case. I acknowledge you and send my love to you, wherever you may be. Normally, when killers are disposing of a body or bodies, they stay within the status quo. They leave the bodies where they fall, they drop them in a ditch or a body of water, they try and bury them. But only a few killers really use their imagination. Only a very select few dig deep down and come up with something unique. Most of them just seem to follow along a boring path of disposal. But once in a while, we come across a killer with some imagination, some ingenuity for disposal techniques. And Joe Ball, sometimes known as the Bluebeard of Elmendorf, or the Butcher of Elmendorf, is no exception to this imaginative minority of killers. Through the years, there have been many Texans who have grown up hearing the tale of Joe Ball and his pet alligators. According to everything I've read this week during my research, this is a popular campfire tale for most Texans. So I thought I would share with the rest of the world. Joseph Douglas Ball was born January 7, 1896 in San Antonio, Texas, to Frank Xavier Ball and Elaine Hart. His father, Frank, was a successful farmer. Frank and his family were one of the first settlers in Elmendorf, a tiny one-horse town just 15 miles southeast of San Antonio, Texas. Upon his arrival in Elmendorf, Frank borrowed some money from the bank and built a factory for processing cotton. Shortly after his factory was built, the railroad came through Elmendorf, which in turn caused Frank's cotton business to boom, making Frank a very wealthy man. Frank dabbled in many different enterprises, but eventually he and his wife opened a general store in Elmendorf. Joe was the second of 8 children, and many of the Ball children would go on to become quite successful in their own rights. Joe's brother Frank Jr. worked for the school district and eventually became a trustee in 1914. Another brother of Joe's, Raymond, opened his own grocery store in Elmendorf. Raymond married a local teacher named Jane Terrell, and in 1940, Jane would be appointed by President Roosevelt as postmaster, and she would go on to serve her community for 27 years. Joe, however, was a quiet kid and enjoyed fishing and exploring the outdoors by himself, rather than playing with the other kids at school. Red flag number 1. When Joe entered his teens, his passion turned from fishing to guns. Joe would spend hours practicing and perfecting his shots. In 2002, in an article in Texas Monthly Magazine, a nephew of Joe's, Bucky Ball, I'm not kidding, Bucky Ball, stated, "My uncle could shoot a bird off a telephone line with a pistol from the bumper of his Model A Ford." I think that means Joe was a good shot in Texan, but I am not 100% sure. Red flag number 2. Joe served his country on the front lines of World War I and was honorably discharged in 1919. When he came back to Elmendorf, Joe worked for his father for a time at the general store, but he quit, most likely when he realized that there was a new need in the community, thanks to the establishment of prohibition. And it was at this time that Joe started his career as a bootlegger. Joe would travel around the area selling whiskey to people from a barrel that he kept in the back of his Model A Ford. Joe's career as a bootlegger was so successful that he hired an assistant named Clifton Wheeler. Later, Clifton would state that the only reason he worked for Joe for so long was because he scared him to death. Clifton stated that whenever Joe would get upset, he would partake of his own whiskey and then proceed to blow off steam by shooting a gun at Clifton's feet to make the man dance for him. Yeah, that's usually why I stay with my bosses when they shoot at my feet. Joe was known as a rough, tough, heavy drinking degenerate around town. He'd sooner fight you than sit and chat about the weather. These were all key characteristics in him becoming quite the successful bootlegger. When Prohibition finally ended, Joe decided to continue selling booze, legally this time. So he opened a saloon called the Sociable Inn. He built his saloon on Highway 181 just on the outskirts of Elmendorf, and it was quite a busy place. Joe was always known for having the prettiest of waitresses employed at his tavern. Joe saw how business was going, which was great, and he decided to add an attraction to make more money. He built a cement pond out back of the saloon where he kept 5 pet alligators. Joe charged people to come and see his pets in the pond. The alligators drew huge crowds, especially during feeding times. To say that Joe was a bit of a fucking maniac would be an understatement here, I think. But not everyone in the town liked Joe or his saloon, or the alligators. One of his neighbors, Elton Crude, who actually was a policeman, complained about the smell wafting from the alligator pond. In response, Joe pulled out a gun and told his crusty neighbor that the smell was just the raw meat that he fed his precious alligators, and this would be the last time that Elton should complain about anything. Another neighbor of Joe's actually packed up and moved to another town just to get away from, quote, that crazy guy, unquote. Well, we can see that Joe is the agreeable sort of guy. As long as everyone agrees with him, he's a happy camper. Joe was successful with his bar, but he was never able to keep waitresses employed for very long. There was a really high turnover rate at the bar. Well, to be fair, good help is hard to find, but he was always able to have plenty of new pretty waitresses to take the spot of those who moved on from his employ. In 1934, Joe met a woman named Minnie Gotthard, or Big Minnie as her friends would call her. Lovely nickname. Joe and Minnie really hit it off, but Joe's friends, yes, the shit snake actually had a couple of friends, didn't like Minnie at all. They told Joe she was bossy, nosy, and all around a shitty person. But Joe loved Minnie, and he ignored what his friends said about her, and shortly after meeting, the two began running the bar together. It's like a romantic comedy. I think Minnie is a great name, and it just isn't used anymore. And that's a shame. I mean, who really wants to name their kid after a mouse? Minnie is great. Love that name. The relationship between Minnie and Joe lasted for about 3 years. That is until Joe fell hard for one of his younger waitresses named Dolores Goodwin, or Buddy, as she was called by friends. Dolores was a waitress at Joe's bar, and despite Joe chucking a bottle at Dolores's face once and leaving her with a scar that ran from her eye to her neck, Dolores fell head over heels in love with Joe. I mean, sure, I could see that. I don't question that she fell in love with a man who cut her. I'm sure there's tons of girls who would have fallen for a shit pig like Joe after something like that. Sweet Christ. This man is a maniac. Now Joe is in love with Dolores and in a relationship with Minnie. But then, wouldn't you know it, Hazel Brown, better known as Schatzi to her friends, started working at the bar. By the way, Schatzi is a German term of endearment. It means treasure or jewel. I knew that one. Didn't have to Google it. And that's about all the German I acquired during my way too long first marriage to a German. Joe had some problems. He was with Minnie and Dolores, but now he wanted Hazel. Hey, don't hate the player, hate the game. Joe was just following his cold black heart in whichever direction it was going to lead him. In September 1937, Minnie's family reported her missing when she seemed to just vanish off the face of the earth. Well, that conveniently took care of one of Joe's problems, didn't it? When the sheriff's deputies asked Joe about Minnie, he informed them that Minnie had to leave town quietly at night because she had cheated on Joe with an African-American man and had given birth to a baby. Naturally, the sheriff's deputies bought this story and cleared the case as one of a shameful retreat by a bad white girl. Ah, the South. A few months after Minnie went missing, Joe married Dolores. What, you think he was going to give up Dolores for Hazel? Oh, no, my friends. He wanted his cake, and he was eating the whole damn thing, too. According to the article in Texas Monthly, after the marriage, Joe told Dolores that he had taken Minnie down to a beach, shot her in the head, and buried her body in the sand. Apparently that didn't sway Dolores too much because the marriage continued. In January of 1938, Dolores was involved in a horrible car accident and ended up having to have her arm amputated as a result of her injuries. However, town legends state that one of Joe's alligators bit her arm off. But there's nothing in the research saying that that was actually the case. But shortly after her arm was amputated, Dolores disappeared. And around the same time, Hazel also vanished into thin air. Wow, you got a problem. 3 women and now down to 0. Joe must have been a basket case, losing all his women at once. Julia Turner was another waitress at Joe's bar who was reported missing, and when asked by the sheriff's deputies, Joe stated that she had left for another job, the same as Minnie. But the thing was that Julia hadn't taken any of her belongings with her when she left for this job. When the deputies came back to Joe and said that Julia hadn't taken any of her things, and was Joe actually sure that Julia left for another job? Joe remembered, quite conveniently, that Julia had gotten into a fight with her roommate, and she came crying desperately to Joe to get away from it. So Joe gave her $500 to get her on a bus and on her way to her new life. That's like $2,000 now. That was awfully generous of Joe, don't you think? Gosh, I wish I had a boss like Julia did. When the deputies were investigating Hazel's disappearance, they realized that she had just opened a bank account at the town bank, but didn't take any of her money with her when she left town. The local deputies were becoming suspicious of good old Joe, so they decided to hand the case over to the Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers decided to make a list of all employees, past and present, for the sociable inn. Once they had accumulated all of the names, they discovered that more than 12 employees of Joe's had been reported as missing. The Rangers knew that something fishy was going on at the sociable inn. So they took Joe's assistant, Clifton Wheeler, in for questioning, and he eventually ratted himself and Joe out. He told the Rangers that he had been forced at gunpoint by Joe to dismember and feed several female bodies to the alligators out back of the bar. As well, Joe's old neighbor, the one who had moved away, finally came forward and informed the Rangers that he had moved away because one night in 1936, he had seen Joe hacking a woman to pieces and feeding the parts to the alligators. And he was scared that Joe would do something like that to him or his family. And the final nail in the coffin for Joe was when a man who worked for Joe's sister approached Deputy Sheriff John Gray and told him about a foul-smelling barrel that Joe had left behind his sister's barn. It smelled, he said, like something was dead inside. The following morning, Deputy John Gray and John Clevenhagen, hope I said that right, went to Joe's sister's barn to investigate, but the barrel was gone. But Joe's sister corroborated the man's story. The Rangers finally felt they had enough evidence to arrest Joe. So, on September 24th, 1938, they entered the sociable inn. When Joe saw the Rangers, he knew the jig was up. He calmly nodded and smiled at the Rangers and asked if he could first close down the bar. The Rangers agreed and sat at the bar. While the two Rangers were sitting at the bar waiting, Joe grabbed a beer and quickly slammed it down. He then walked over to his register and rang in a no sale. He then proceeded to take a gun from the drawer of the till and shoot himself. Some say that Joe shot himself in the head. Others say that he shot himself in the heart. Either way, he achieved what he was trying to do, and that was take his own life. Clifton Wheeler, Joe's assistant, was now the only one left alive, and the Rangers wanted some answers. So they picked up Clifton and brought him in for questioning. He informed them that Joe's girlfriend, Hazel Brown, had fallen in love with another man and was planning on moving away to start a new life. As well, Hazel had been accusing Joe of Big Minnie's murder. These two things apparently pushed Joe into a rage, and Joe killed Hazel and buried her body. Rangers thought this story was a little hokey because, from what they had found out about Joe, the only thing he liked to do was dismember and feed his victims to his beloved alligator babies. So, the Rangers told Clifton that they needed proof. So Clifton took them to where Joe had buried Hazel's body. Clifton took the Rangers to an isolated spot approximately 3 miles from town near the San Antonio River. He surveyed the riverbank and then walked to a spot and began to dig. Suddenly, everyone present at the hole was attacked by a horrendous smell coming from it. Clifton dug a little deeper and finally pulled up 2 arms and 2 legs, and finally a torso. The Rangers asked Clifton where Hazel's head was. Clifton weakly pointed to a burned-out campfire pit on the riverbank. The Rangers walked over to the pit and started sifting through. Eventually, they found Hazel's jawbone, teeth, and parts of her skull. Clifton told the Rangers that he and Joe were hitting the sauce pretty hard one night, and after a few hours of drinking, Joe told him to go and grab some blankets and meet him in the car. Joe then drove to his sister's house and had Clifton load a really heavy barrel inside the car. Then Joe drove to the river, where he pulled a gun out on Clifton and forced him to dig the grave. Then he made Clifton empty the barrel into the grave. Clifton said that when he opened the barrel, Hazel was inside. Then Clifton told the Rangers that Joe forced him with the gun to help dismember Hazel's body, and that once Hazel's body was chopped up, the two men filled in the grave and threw her head on the campfire. They then sat by the fire and drank while they watched her head burn. Nothing like a couple of buddies enjoying a nice relaxing fire by a river. Jesus. The Rangers asked Clifton about Minnie and where she actually was. Clifton said that Minnie had gotten pregnant and Joe wanted nothing to do with her or a baby, as it would interfere with his lifestyle and, of course, with the relationship he had on the side with Dolores. So Joe took Minnie and Clifton out to a secluded beach near Corpus Christi under the guise of a fun night of drinking on the beach. When Minnie had her back to Joe, he pulled out a gun and shot her in the head. Joe then had Clifton help him bury Minnie in the sand. The Rangers started excavating the beach where Minnie was supposedly buried, and on October 14th, 1938, they found Minnie's body. Police continued to question Clifton about all the other missing women, but Clifton insisted that he knew nothing else about any other missing women. While Rangers were searching the bar, they found a scrapbook containing photos of dozens of women. According to Deputy Sheriff J.W. Davis, this might lead to the discovery of one or a dozen more murders. However, none of the photos ever proved to have any connection to Joe. Eventually, Dolores was located in California. She was alive and apparently had left Joe and the area for a new start in San Diego. 2 weeks after finding Dolores, Rangers located another one of the women that had been previously listed as missing from the tavern. As it turns out, not all the rotting flesh in the alligator pond was human. In a 1957 interview with the San Antonio Light, Dolores Buddy Goodwin stated that Joe never put no people in that alligator tank, she said. Joe wouldn't do a thing like that. He wasn't no horrible monster. Joe was a sweet, kind, good man, and he never hurt nobody unless he was driven to it. There were just 2 murders, she said. Well, it is possible that Joe never fed anyone to his alligators. In another article that I read about Dolores, when they found her alive in California, she stated that she knew about the murders of Hazel and Minnie and decided that she didn't want the same fate and had decided to escape during the night from Joe. So it could be one or the other. Some estimations that Joe Ball killed at least 20 of his waitresses from the sociable. Rangers believed that he just simply cleared up the remaining flesh and bone after the alligators had had their human smorgasbord. Clifton Wheeler was arrested and convicted as an accessory to the murder and spent 2 years in the Hoos Cow. Joe was buried at St. Anthony's Cemetery in Elmendorf, Texas, near the front gate. Well, you didn't expect him to be in the back, did you? And for the alligators? Well, they were rehomed at the San Antonio Zoo, where they enjoyed the rest of their days. I wonder what they fed the alligators at the zoo. And that is the story of Joe Ball, the butcher of Elmendorf. My thoughts. That was an interesting case. This is one of those cases where I think time has altered some of the facts of the case. There is a picture of Joe that is used quite often across the internet, and he's in one of those old-timey wrestling jerseys. It looks like a tank top that is attached to shorts. He's got a satchel across his chest, and he's holding a bottle of whiskey, and he has quite the sour puss on him. But nonetheless, he is a big man, and I wouldn't want to fuck with him. I think that this was like a love pentagram of some kind, where Joe fell in love with one woman, Minnie, then fell in love with Hazel, then Dolores. I think if investigators had have looked hard enough, they might have found the missing people off their list. Remember, this was the 30s. If somebody packed up and moved to another state, they could even just move to another county. They may never be found again. Maybe Joe was a serial killer, and those missing women from his bar were actually fed to the alligators. Unfortunately, with Joe taking his own life and Clifton only ever owning up to the 2 murders that he knew about, we're never gonna know. Either way, Joe was responsible for the murders of Hazel and Minnie. Did he deserve to die? I don't think so, but he made that decision for himself. He could have spent the rest of his life in jail. Hell, Clifton only got 2 years. Most likely, Joe wouldn't have spent that much time in jail. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our previous episodes, please head over to this Patreon page and support us. Drop us an email at thebitterwitness@gmail.com or give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We're going to leave it at that for this week. Enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.